and that there can be errors here, or there can be errors here. If that's going to happen, then you can imagine that the inheritance pattern of mitochondrial disease is going to be quite complex. Some mitochondrial diseases are going to look as though there's a code problem in the nucleus, and some mitochondrial diseases are going to look as though there's a code problem in the mitochondrial DNA because of the inheritance pattern. It's going to vary. So this leads us to two terms, which is something called autosomal dominant. There are some nuclear diseases due to defects of the code in the nuclear DNA. If they are strong, if you like, then they lead to an inheritance pattern, strong in their effect. They lead to an inheritance pattern in which if you have an individual who's affected, in this case it's the father. Remember I said that father will give half of his nuclear DNA to each of his children. So on average, half of his children may acquire his defect. And if this is strong, in the sense that's what we mean by autosomal dominant, if it's strong so that all you need is one copy of an abnormal gene to have the disease, then half of that father's children, on average, this is just statistical, will have that disease. Or at least will carry the gene for that disease. And if you notice, you can see that there are a number of children who will acquire the good gene from the father and one or other of the good genes from the mother, and they will not be affected. So there's going to be that pattern for some of these diseases. Some of these nuclear genes, the effect is not so strong. You in fact need two abnormal genes to express the disease. If you get only one abnormal gene, you may be just a carrier of that disease and not actually express it. So if that's the case, then it'll lead to this pattern. For an individual to be affected, they have to have two abnormal genes. Both of their parents would have to be having one of those abnormal genes that's been given to them. Some of their siblings will only have half, and they'll just be carriers. And some will just get the normal gene from both of their parents, and they'll be entirely unaffected. So that's what's called a recessive pattern of inheritance. And on average, only 1 in 4 of the children will be affected, half will be carriers, and 1 in 4 will be totally unaffected. So because some of these genes, these nuclear genes that I said that encode some of the information in the respiratory chain, will actually behave in this way. There'll be an autosomal recessive pattern of inheritance. Now, what if there's a mitochondrial genomic problem? Well, remember I said that all of an individual's mitochondrial DNA does come from their mother. Then, in this situation, every child from an affected mother will carry that abnormal gene. But whilst a male who's acquired the mitochondrial gene defect might be affected, they will not actually pass that down. That's called maternal inheritance. But that's very simplistic because of this other phenomenon. Remember I told you that there are many, many mitochondria within each cell, and within each of these mitochondria there are many, many mitochondrial DNA molecules. That leads to a mosaic within the cell itself. So, because of kind of random assortment of this mosaic, if you think of mosaic tiles, if you have an affected cell with what I've got here, some good mitochondria, some bad mitochondria, what I mean by that is mitochondria containing a genetic abnormality, and the cell divides, when the cell divides, just by chance, some good mitochondria can go, some cells can have all good mitochondria, some can have a mixture, and some can have a mixture in which predominantly most of it is mitochondria containing mitochondrial DNA that carries a defect. That leads to this kind of mosaicism. when that happens, what you see in maternal inheritance is that the individual is a mosaic of different kinds of cells, different kinds of tissues. That some cells, some tissues might be affected more in one individual and not so much so in another individual who's carrying mitochondrial DNA defect, which leads to differences in the way that the diseases are expressed in individuals who carry these genes. So, if, for example, most of the bad mitochondria, it seems, just by chance, happen to segregate out in tissues that, let's take, for example, an individual who's responsible for an individual's vision or their hearing, then one individual might have a vision problem, one individual might have a hearing problem, one individual might have some other kind of a problem, infected tissue problem. So, in summary, I've talked about maternal inheritance and these dominant and recessive patterns of inheritance that can also be seen in mitochondrial diseases of the respiratory chain. So if you look at the mitochondrial DNA itself, since about the early 90s, there have been a number of abnormalities that have been detected in this mitochondrial DNA. Since it was quite small, it was easy to analyze. And a lot of these are kind of single errors where there have been just single genetic code as a number of letters, or just a letter has been misplaced and leads to some abnormality that causes some problem in the respiratory chain. Many, 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 many. All these things are diseases associated with individual errors. This is kind of not even, the number. They're far more than this. In addition to little single errors, there can be big chunks of this missing as well. And for reasons that we don't fully understand, although there are many theories about this, those kind of errors where big chunks of the mitochondrial DNA are missing tend not to be transmitted maternally at all. They tend to occur in a single individual in their development, at some point in their development, and stay fixed in that individual, and they tend not to get transmitted. So, this leads to a lot of complexity. It turns out that in the case of childhood disorders of the respiratory chain, about 20% of them are due to mitochondrial DNA mutations. In adults, maybe adults that we see with this disease, maybe about 80% of them have mitochondrial DNA diseases. But this is a shifting landscape all the time, because more and more of these nuclear genes are being discovered, and this percentage or this balance will shift as we know more and more about the errors that actually cause the disease, and that's something that David's going to talk about in his talk, I think, a bit later. So, if you want to put this in its context then, in the clinic, about 15 to 20% of all the mitochondrial respiratory chain disorders are due to maternally inherited mutations. So if you want to look at how common these things, I'm sorry about the color, this sort of changed as I transferred from one system to the other, but some of this data was in fact derived from David's work. I think this figure, which is about the prevalence of mitochondrial DNA, of mitochondrial disease, not mitochondrial DNA diseases, in the community. It's about 1 in 6,500 live birds. So if you look at, you can kind of split this up into childhood and adult mitochondrial or respiratory chain diseases, and it's about prevalence of around 6 per 100,000 in children and maybe 9 per 100,000 individuals in adults from various population-based studies. So that's a kind of a sort of ballpark figure. much is said about the fact that these are quite common. These certainly are more common than some of the other commonly inherited genetic disorders, single gene disorders that you know about, for example, Huntington's disease, etc. However, to put it still in context, in the clinic, these are still relatively uncommon diseases. This is to put it in context with other diseases. For example, this form of genetic muscular dystrophy occurs a little bit more commonly than that. Certainly more common than Huntington's disease. And then other diseases that you're familiar with, like motor neuron disease, etc., are even more common. These are adult disorders. I'm an adult neurologist, so these are the sort of diseases that I would be talking about, thinking about in my clinic. So, remember I said that every cell practically in the body contains this mitochondria, and that there'll be a few exceptions there. So every cell could suffer from a defect in mitochondrial energy production. That means every tissue, and those tissues that are requiring the most energy may well be ones, therefore, primarily affected, are going to be the ones that are going to cause the individual to have a disease. And of those very important ones, the brain, because it requires a lot of energy. Even just sitting doing nothing, your brain consumes an enormous amount of energy. So this organ is susceptible to mitochondrial failure, which is why neurologists largely have come to be interested in these areas. These were primarily neurological disorders or muscle diseases in children, which is how, in the history of the understanding of these diseases, neurologists were involved. But of course, that's not the only thing. Endocrine organs can be involved, the heart can be involved, the eye, and the hearing through dysfunction of the ear, but of course, as I said, really any organ. So, the sort of things that we see in the clinic are reflecting this. Some weakness of muscles, and very commonly affected are muscles that are very energy intensive requiring. So these are muscles that move your lids and move your eyeballs. They've got a particular pattern of distribution of muscle fibers in them, which respond to, which if you think about moving your eyes, you need to be able to move your eyes really, really quickly with fast twitches, which means you need to be able to generate a lot of energy very quickly. And so the muscles that move the eyeballs are heavily dependent on those sort of muscle fibers. So a common feature, not invariable, is muscle weakness involving those muscles, leading to some paralysis of the muscles that move the eyeballs, or the ones that lift the lids. So droopy eyelids, called ptosis, or ophthalmoplegia, which is paralysis of the eye muscles. Muscle weakness elsewhere in the body, like the limbs, so leading to weakness, or because of just general energy depletion in the body, a lot of trouble with just having the energy to do exercise, or even simple things like vacuuming or walking, more a few hundred meters. So that's called effort intolerance. Of course, heart can be involved, leading to disturbances of the rhythm of the heart, but also the capacity of the heart to work as a pump. Hearing, deafness problems, and a number of brain diseases. Not just one, but lots. Some of the common diseases that we're familiar with in the neurology clinics, like stroke-like problems, epilepsy, movement disorders, like unsteadiness or twitchiness, dementia or capacity to think and remember, and even headache, migraine-type headache. And then, of course, the eye. So the optic nerve itself, or the retina, so damage to that. So these pictures, by the way, are from patients who've given their permission for this kind of image to be shown. And here we see the droopiness of the eyelids in this lady. You can see that she has She's using her forehead muscles to drag her lids up.